many economists coming on our air and saying, oh, this is a bubble and it's going to burst and this is going to be a real issue for the economy. Some say it could even cause a recession at some point. What is the worst case scenario if, in fact, we were to see prices come down substantially across the country?
Well, I guess I don't buy your premise. It's a pretty unlikely possibility. We've never had a decline in house prices on a nationwide basis.
Ben Bernanke became chairman of the Federal Reserve Board in February 2006, the top year for subprime lending. But despite numerous warnings, Bernanke and the Federal Reserve Board did nothing. There was another ticking time bomb in the financial system. AIG, the world's largest insurance company, was selling huge quantities of derivatives called credit default swaps. For investors who owned CDOs, credit default swaps worked like an insurance policy. An investor who purchased a credit default swap paid AIG a quarterly premium. If the CDO went bad, AIG promised to pay the investor for their losses. But unlike regular insurance, speculators could also buy credit default swaps from AIG in order to bet against CDOs they didn't own.
In insurance, you can only insure something you own. Let's say you and I own property. I own a house. I can only insure that house once. The derivatives universe essentially enables anybody to actually insure that house. So you could insure that, somebody else could do that, so 50 people might insure my house. So what happens is, if my house burns down, now the number of losses in the system becomes proportionately larger.
Since credit default swaps were unregulated, AIG didn't have to put aside any money to cover potential losses. Instead, AIG paid its employees huge cash bonuses as soon as contracts were signed. But if the CDOs later went bad, AIG would be on the hook. AIG's financial products division in London issued $500 billion worth of credit default swaps during the bubble, many of them for CDOs backed by subprime mortgages. The 400 employees at AIG FP made $3.5 billion between 2000 and 2007.
You're going to make an extra $2 million a year or $10 million a year for putting your financial institution at risk. Someone else pays the bill. You don't pay the bill. Would you make that bet? Most people who worked on Wall Street said, sure.
You have a $14 million oceanfront home in Florida. You have a summer vacation home in Sun Valley, Idaho. You and your wife have an art collection filled with million-dollar paintings.
Lehman owned a bunch of corporate jets. Do you know about this?
Yes.
How many were there?
Well, there were 6, including the 767s. We also had a helicopter.
I see. Isn't that kind of a lot of planes to have for?
That now provides a new kind of a fiscal straitjacket for Congress. And that's good for the taxpayers. I mean, it's incredibly positive news.
Cutbacks in food programs for the elderly.
Faced with a budget crisis, the libraries are all shutting down.
On the chopping block is the trauma center in Los Angeles.
Underfunded, the parks will continue to deteriorate.
Budget crisis is closing the school's doors for good.
These haunting images have ignited a painful conversation about people who live on the edges of society.
These are the families who listened to the authorities, who followed direction, who believed in the government. These are law-abiding citizens who have been left behind. They did everything they were told. They are just left behind. There's nothing offered to them.
Can you believe this is happening in our country? Can you believe this is happening in the wealthiest country, not only around the earth today, but the wealthiest country that's ever been?
There's not as much money around Washington as there used to be.
Borrowers had borrowed on average 99.3% of the price of the house, which means they have no money in the house. If anything goes wrong, they're going to walk away from the mortgage. This is not a loan you'd really make, right? You've got to be crazy. But somehow you took 8,000 of these loans, and by the time the guys were done at Goldman Sachs and the rating agencies, 2/3 of the loans were rated AAA, which meant they were rated as safe as government securities. It's utterly mad.
Goldman Sachs sold at least $3.1 billion worth of these toxic CDOs in the first half of 2006. The CEO of Goldman Sachs at this time was Henry Paulson, the highest paid CEO on Wall Street.
Good morning. Welcome to the White House. I'm pleased to announce that I will nominate Henry Paulson to be the Secretary of the Treasury. He's a lifetime of business experience. He has an intimate knowledge of financial markets. He's earned a reputation for candor and integrity.
You might think it would be hard for Paulson to adjust to a meager government salary. But taking the job as Treasury Secretary was the best financial decision of his life. Paulson had to sell his $485 million of Goldman stock when he went to work for the government. But because of a law passed by the first President Bush, he didn't have to pay any taxes on it. It saved him $50 million. By late 2006, Goldman had taken things a step further. It didn't just sell toxic CDOs. It started actively betting against them at the same time it was telling customers that they were high-quality investments. By purchasing credit default swaps from AIG, Goldman could bet against CDOs it didn't own and get paid when the CDOs failed.
I asked if anybody called the customers and said, you know, we don't really like this kind of mortgage anymore, and we thought you ought to know. And, you know, they didn't really say anything, but, you know, you just feel the laughter coming over the phone.
Goldman Sachs bought at least $22 billion of credit default swaps from AIG. It was so much that Goldman realized that AIG itself might go bankrupt. So they spent $150 million insuring themselves against AIG's potential collapse. Then in 2007, Goldman went even further. They started selling CDOs specifically designed so that the more money their customers lost, the more money Goldman Sachs made.
$600 million of Timberwolf securities is what you sold. Before you sold them, this is what your sales team were telling to each other. Boy, that Timberwolf was one shitty deal.
This was an email to me in late June.
Right. And you sold
after the
Timberwolf.
transaction.
No, you sold Timberwolf after as well.
We did trades after that.
Yeah, okay. The next email, take a look, July 107, tells the sales force the top priority is Timberwolf. Your top priority to sell is that shitty deal. If you have an adverse interest to your client, you have the duty to disclose that to your client, to tell that client of your adverse interest. That's my question.
Sure, Mr. Chairman, I'm just trying to understand.
No, I think you understand it. I don't think you want to answer.
Do you believe that you have a duty to act in the best interests of your clients?
Again, Senator, I will repeat, we have a duty to serve our clients by showing prices on transactions that they ask us to show prices for.
What do you think about selling securities which your own people think are crap? Does that bother you?
I think they would, again, as a hypothetical.
No, this is real.
Well, then I don't.
We heard it today.
Well,
we heard it today. This is a shitty deal. This is crap.
I heard nothing today that makes me think anything went wrong.
Is there not a conflict when you sell something to somebody and then are determined to bet against that same security and you don't disclose that to the person you're selling it? Do you see a problem?
In the context of market making, that is not a conflict.
When you heard that your employees in these emails said, God, what a shitty deal. God, what a piece of crap. Do you feel anything?
I think that's very unfortunate to have on email.
Are you embarrassed?
And very unfortunate. I don't.
On email,
please don't take that.
How
the wrong
about
way.
feeling that way?
I think it's very unfortunate for anyone to have said that in any form.
Is it your understanding that your competitors were engaged in similar activities?
Yes, and to a greater extent than us in most cases.
Morgan Stanley was also selling mortgage securities that it was betting against. A year later, Morgan Stanley had made hundreds of millions of dollars, while the investors had lost almost all of their money. Robert Gneizda met with Ben Bernanke and the Federal Reserve Board 3 times after Bernanke became chairman.
Only at the last meeting did he suggest that there was a problem and that the government ought to look into it. 2009, March 11th.